Hello everyone and welcome to Saturn Returns with me, Kagi Dunlop. This is a podcast that aims to bring clarity during transitional times where there can be confusion and doubt. Today I am joined by Alex Light, a body positivity advocate, journalist, chart-topping podcast host and founder of Light London. After battling with eating disorders in her earlier life, Alex has successfully crafted and created a platform that encourages body positivity and champions women's unfiltered bodies. I wanted to have her on the show because it was a big part of my own Saturn Returns journey, sort of making peace with my relationship with my body. And I know that it's something that a lot of people struggle with navigating, I'd say particularly women, and we're constantly told and given all this messaging that we aren't enough, that we need to be thinner, and then when we get to that place then we're told we're too thin, and it feels like we're sort of chasing this goal that doesn't really exist when it comes to our bodies. And you only have to look back and see how, the way me and Alex were brought up, there was this obsession with size zero, an obsession with asking women about their weight online. And when I watched the Beckham documentary recently, I was reminded of how much pressure Victoria Beckham was under and how, the commentary around her weight. And whilst it's improved quite a lot, there is still this fascination with women's bodies in a way that's quite disproportionate to men. And so I really enjoyed having this conversation and kind of unpacking a lot of that and hearing about Alex's journey of overcoming some of those obstacles and getting to a place of self-compassion and self-love with her own relationship with her body. So I hope you enjoy this conversation between myself and Alex. Alex, welcome.
Hi.
I'm trying not to say the same thing that I say every episode, but welcome to the Saturn Returns podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
And welcome to my apartment.
It's so nice. It's such a nice, comfy, cozy setup here. I love it.
I'm a Taurus and I feel like it's very, very much represents my
Does it?
sun sign, yeah.
Is it Taurus vibes?
Taurus-like, homely, cozy, comfort.
It's very cozy. I love it.
Thank you.
It's really nice.
I'm really excited to have you on because we've never met before.
No.
But we were saying just before we started recording that I think we've known of each other for a while.
Yeah.
Because we're about the same age.
We are. You probably hate people saying this, but I remember watching you Made in Chelsea all those years ago.
So you had that experience from, me a decade ago. So this is going to be interesting. But I wanted to have you on because we recently connected online when you put up something about how the sort of media talk about women and how they talk about men. But before we get into that, for the audience that doesn't know, would you be able to explain a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes. So I'm a journalist originally. I was at a magazine for a really long time, like 10 years. And I was writing about celebrities and fashion and beauty. And I also had like an Instagram account as well where I'd share my fashion and beauty pictures and a lot of these super curated, super edited pictures of myself. And in the background of all of this, what was going on was I was suffering from an eating disorder, one that I'd had for a really long time, but that was coming to a head. And when I eventually sought recovery from it, I kind of started to realize that what I was doing online started to feel really at odds with what was going on in my private life.
As in you were doing the therapy and you were working through it, but then the stuff you were putting out online was almost like
exactly
the opposite of that.
Exactly. It felt very counterintuitive. I was starting to learn through therapy that, my body size and my appearance wasn't the most interesting thing about me, and that my worth wasn't tied up in my appearance. And at the same time, I was editing my photos, to within an inch of my life. I like downloaded Photoshop so I could use the liquify tool to like slim my body before even the apps existed. And it just started to really jar with me and what I was learning. And so I had this like don't want to say crisis, but I was just like, one night, I'm done with this. I'm not doing it anymore. And I'm going to talk about what's actually going on in my life. Talk about having an eating disorder, talk about having problems with my body image and my struggles with my weight. And that was it, really. That was the turning point.
At what point was that? What age were you?
I think I was like 20, I want to say 26, 27. Mm-hmm. And it was it was gradual from there. Like now I'm at the point where I talk about anti-diet culture a lot. I talk about beauty standards and body confidence. Like it's a huge, like makes up a great deal of what I talk about. And so it was a gradual process to kind of get there. But I became just more and more passionate about it the more I learned about it, and I felt more like galvanized into action the more I learned, and I guess I became a bit angry learning about why we feel this way, why women feel so bad in their own skin and feel so much shame around their bodies and themselves. So I guess that's, in a nutshell, how I am, like why I do what I do now, which is, I mean, I struggle to like sum up what I do, but I guess like body confidence activist.
And it's obviously resonating with so many people because you've developed this huge community online, which I kind of want to get into the more collective narratives of the conversation that we're going to have, but also from a personal experience. You said that your eating disorder and that kind of journey had been happening for a long time, but then you got to the point where it kind of came to a head. When do you feel like it sort of originated for you? And if you could say, do you think there was a reason why?
My eating problems, my eating disorder. I grew up in a really diet culture heavy environment, which I think a lot of us did, especially I was born in the 80s.
Oh my God, it was like the sort of there was no nutrition, health. It was sort of eat a piece of cheese if you feel like you're going to pass out and have Diet Coke and smoke cigarettes. Like that was kind of what we were told to do at school. Were you at a girls only school?
I was, yeah.
Which perpetuates it sometimes.
Totally. And disordered eating was really glamorized as well. It was, I mean, like cigarettes were a glamorous substitute for food, and it was the era of nothing tastes as good as skinny feels, and we had Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie and I guess that era of role models, for lack of
size zero.
The size zero.
And this was all really when we were kind of teenagers, going through puberty. Our bodies were changing, and then you're kind of, as it changes, you kind of then feel this need to try and control it, or you don't like the changes that are happening.
Exactly. You're in those formative years. You're so vulnerable, and I was always. I still haven't got to grips with how really to describe it, but I was always chubby. Mm-hmm. Like I was never fat, but I certainly wasn't thin, and I was acutely aware of it and acutely aware that it was not a good thing, and that my peers who were smaller than me, like that was very much coveted and that was praised and that was admired. And
did you ever receive criticism for that, or people being mean to you or anything like that?
I mean, comments, that comments that were just passing off the cuff comments for the people that said them, but for me who was on the receiving end, things that still stick with me.
Yeah, they're so damaging
today. I actually recently did a talk that my dad came along to, and we were talking about the older generation and how they grew up around body image and believing that everything thin was good and everything fat was bad. And we had this really cathartic but emotional moment where he apologized to me in this room full of people, because he would call me pretty but plump. Aww. And he apologized to me, in front of all these people, and it was emotional. I was really trying so hard not to cry.
He must have felt terrible, because he probably didn't realize how that was going to impact you.
He just didn't know. No.
And I think also our parents, like, we want to please them and get their validation, so the comments that they make about our weight or anything. I mean, obviously as a society, nobody should, but our parents, especially when we're young and in those formative years, it can be really impactful.
So impactful and so long lasting. And you're right, it's like they're our everything when we're growing up. We seek validation from them more than anyone. So yeah, there were things like that will just, I think, that always sort of stuck with me. And I think, I mean, the jury's out on eating disorders and whether they're nature or nurture. But I think for me, it was a mix of, I was very sensitive, really still am, extremely sensitive, and very much susceptible to black and white thinking and perfectionist tendencies. And that, coupled with all the diet culture that I was absorbing day after day, all these messages that thinness was going to be what made me better and made me more worthy and more lovable and desirable. I think all of that together was just, compounded, and that was, before the eating disorder, like I started dieting super young, like 11, I think, started dieting. And from then on, tried every single diet under the sun, like you name it, I tried it. And it wasn't until my 20s that tipped over into real, like, diagnosable eating disorder territory.
And what did that look like?
I mean, it was just hell. I have so much empathy for people who are stuck in a diet cycle, because it's just hell and it's so trapping. And I would do diet after diet after diet, and each one would, I don't like to say I failed, each one failed me, because they're always set up to fail, but every single diet. And I actually, as is really common with dieting, I dieted myself up in weight. I ended up in much heavier weight than when I began, because I was just then stuck in a cycle of restriction and binging, and just
sort of devour, like depriving yourself. And I mean, I resonate with so much of what you're saying, especially at that time in my life. And like, you grew up in a culture that was very much size 0. There was no such thing as too skinny. Girls' sort of sense of self-worth and beauty that was then sort of entangled in that. And then, like you say, it's that awful cycle when the same voice that tells you when you're thin enough you'll be worthy also tells you to go and eat like the entire cake. And so it's this really toxic relationship that you end up having with yourself, where you're like, you can't get out, and there doesn't seem to be, there's no, like, the goal that you're trying to achieve doesn't actually exist, because even when you achieve it, the goalpost gets further away. Right. And I think that's one of the most difficult things about eating disorders, is that once that kind of permeates the mind, it's really hard to unravel and to get back to a place of feeling like you don't need to reach anything in order to feel worthy and enough. So I also empathize with anyone that's listening to this and is struggling with some of these themes.
Oh, it's so hard, because it's true. You end up pinning your happiness on this number, which is, this number that you're going to hit on the scale, which is totally arbitrary. And, for me, anecdotally, the proof is in the pudding. Like, I got down to I'm saying this in air quotes, goal weight, and much further beyond that. And I never ever reached any level of happiness. I was just getting more and more unhappy. Yeah. And also what you're saying, that dichotomy that we have in this society that is so weird. It's like, on one hand, food is this huge source of comfort for us, and this huge source of joy and tradition, and it's like a social currency as well. And then on the other hand, we're supposed to be as thin as we possibly can. And it's so confusing. It's just such a minefield, because it's, the messaging is conflicting.
And also I remember when I was younger, someone saying, in terms of addictions, and often, an eating disorder is very much wrapped up in a kind of addictive behavior. But the reason that an eating disorder can be the most challenging of all those sort of things to overcome is because it's the one thing that you have to address and have 3 times a day, every day for the rest of your life, or however
Right.
many meals you need to survive and to actually thrive. Whereas with alcohol or drugs or gambling or whatever, you can just cut it out.
Yeah.
And it's far easier
Yeah.
when you cut that thing out to just get on with life, and it sort of normalizes and you
Yeah.
forget about that thing, hopefully.
Yeah.
Whereas this is so confronting when you get to that point, because you are being confronted with that internal critic and that challenge so many times. That's why it's such a difficult thing to truly overcome.
Right. I remember so clearly, and this was from my mind in being in a really unhealthy, bad place. But I remember feeling vividly that I was jealous of people who had like a gambling addiction or an alcohol addiction, thinking, I wish I had that instead, because then I wouldn't have to be faced with food three times a day. Well, the eating disorder recovery protocol was 3 meals a day, 2 snacks. That's an awful lot of food that you're having to face. And I remember thinking, this is so complicated and confusing and painful, and I obviously I do not envy anyone with any kind of addiction. And I know that the jury's out on that as well, as to whether eating disorders are a physiological addiction. But it certainly, it felt that way. And it is hard, because you can't just throw out that relationship. You have to mend it, and you have to cultivate this relationship with something that has just been the most toxic relationship of your life.
And like a tormentor in your life.
Yeah. And it's one of the hardest things I've ever done. And it continues to be one of the hardest things that I have to do. It's so, so hard.
In terms of the recovery process, what do you feel, kind of looking back, do you feel that you were adequately supported in, you said that it was like 3 meals a day, 2 snacks, because I know a lot of people that have gone through similar things and to very extreme circumstances where they've had to go, into the priory or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And the way that it's dealt with feels quite, I don't know, what is your perspective on like how it was dealt with from a professional standpoint?
I think this is so difficult, and eating disorder recovery is notoriously difficult, which is why anorexia nervosa has the highest mortality rate of any psychiatric disorder. It's so difficult to treat. For me, the 3 meals a day, 2 snacks a day ultimately provided a sense of comfort and gave me a little bit of control.
Because a lot of it is about control,
it is,
isn't it?
yeah, and having to
routine and
exactly, and I thrive on that, and letting go of my eating disorder, which was like this simultaneously my best, closest friend and biggest source of comfort, and also my worst enemy, the most toxic thing in my life. But it had complete control over my life, and part of me really enjoyed that control. So letting that go was so difficult and so painful, that I welcomed order and control in other ways into my life, and that for me was part of it. But my recovery, and I like to stress this a lot, because my recovery was really slow, really, really slow, and it took me a really long time. And I think I was harmed by having consumed narratives that a girl is sick and she gets help and then she recovers, and it's just like that, everything clicks into place with this help. She has some therapy and then she gets better. And it wasn't like that for me at all. It was so messy. It was so hard and so long. And all the time I just kept thinking of, but I read about that girl who went in as an inpatient and did 3 weeks, and then she was fine, and then she got better. Yeah. And I was constantly beating myself, I guess, just holding myself to another standard. So that's something that I really like to talk about now as well. And it's not to discourage people and say your recovery is going to be so impossible, don't do it, because it's the best thing in the world.
Your recovery, basically.
But don't compare your recovery, yeah, because only you are going through this with everything on your back of what you've experienced. You're looking through the lens of what you've experienced, everything that you've gone through, and it's just completely different for everyone. And we've just got to be so kind to ourselves in this process, even though it's really hard. And especially as women, it's so hard to be kind to ourselves and so hard to lead with compassion and self-compassion. But that, I think, is ultimately what was really the key for me, is when I put my trust in the hands of the professionals, and also I started to be compassionate with myself. That was then the game changer.
Because when you move from a place of really, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but from what I've experienced myself is an internal critic that's really quite self-loathing.
Yeah.
And then trying to shift that to a place of self-compassion.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of stuff on social media that's about that sort of positivity and everything. But I think for someone that's in the sort of trenches of it, it can feel so far removed to have that self-compassion. Yeah. What were the kind of steps for you to get to that place? And then when did you feel like you were able to talk about it? And what was that kind of decision process like?
You know, I think the number one thing for me that I go back to time and time again with compassion for myself is, I just find that the quickest and most powerful fix for this is taking myself out of the equation and projecting it onto someone else. So if someone was coming to me and explaining my story, would I go back to them with judgment or shame or a sense of embarrassment? And the answer's always no. I would have compassion for them. I'd have empathy for them. Their story makes sense. It makes sense that they feel like this. And I find that simple shift of taking myself out of the equation immediately allows me to tap into that compassion for myself.
And also there must be a huge amount of grief when you finally make that shift, because you're having to acknowledge the way that you've spoken to yourself, or the unkind words, or all of these things, and really kind of face them head on.
There's a lot of cognitive dissonance, I think.
100%.
And in some ways it's probably easier to just continue as you are doing, because then you don't have to face that. But I think it's just, I shout about compassion so much because I just think it's
keep shouting.
I think it's just so
the world
important.
Needs it.
Yeah.
And then in terms of putting yourself online, that was a hugely courageous thing to do with something that's so vulnerable, that it didn't sound like you were by any means like completely healed or completely recovered when you started speaking about it. No. What was that whole experience like, and what was was there any trolling? I've suddenly gone.
Yeah.
Suddenly I was like, is that the word? Was there any trolling? Is it trolling?
Yeah, trolling. Or trolling. No, I'm questioning it. Trolling.
Or was it very, supportive? What was the kind of whole experience like?
So I remember, and I'd like to say that I did it. It came from like a careful and considered place, and there was something that I thought about, and I wanted to help other people. But that's not the truth. It was actually came from a place of like desperation, of like, I can't really carry on like this. I am desperate, and I'm looking for any outlet, and I'm just desperately reaching for any kind of help. And that's when I first shared it, and I instantly had this like outpouring of like positive reinforcement. And this was, I don't know what year this was. I'm so bad with dates and ages, but it was a long time ago now, like 8 years, I want to say. And it was at a time when people didn't speak about eating disorders or body image or any weight struggles. It was very much kept under wraps. There's a lot of shame and stigma around it and embarrassment. So I felt like I was the only one who was experiencing what I was experiencing. I thought I was defective. There was just something wrong with me. I was just too sensitive. I thought into things too much. I was too vain, which is another common, eating disorder trope. And so when I spoke about it, and I received literally, I couldn't believe how many people were responding to me, telling me, all privately, because people was, still a lot of stigma around at that point. So many people telling me that they were in similar positions, and a lot of those people were friends and people that I'd known for such a long time.
And you had no idea.
And I had no idea, and they had no idea about me, and we just never broached this because it was so shrouded in this shame.
And that's one of the really amazing things about social media, is that you can actually share that vulnerability, find a community, and in turn it does give you the sort of sense of anchoring in, paradoxically, confidence in an area where you felt perhaps very underconfident, because you realize that there are a lot more people that feel and think the way you do, right?
Totally. Yeah, that's the brilliant thing about social media, for all its pitfalls, like the community, the sense of community. And it was really, really powerful for me in just not feeling alone, not feeling like there was something wrong with me. And then I just kind of realized, like, why do we feel so much shame about this? There's so many of us going through stuff like this. Like, surely we just need to open up this conversation.
Yeah, which is kind of brings us perfectly into, you know, what I messaged you about, because you put up this post, and that was more to do with, but it's all kind of one of the same thing. It was 2 Daily Mail articles. One was, I can't remember the woman that it was, but she had a big grey streak in her hair, and the title was, "You've let yourself go. Don't you know that, like, grey hair is a sign that, you know, you're no longer desirable," whatever it might be. And then you put next to it a Daily Mail article by different journalists, different time, or around the same sort of time, with Colin Farrell saying, who was completely grey, saying, "Look at the silver fox around town shopping." And I mean, she actually looked, not that it matters, but beautifully preserved.
I know.
Was so, like, immaculately put together, and he was like disheveled and all over the place.
I know.
And it just sums up like what we have to experience as women.
Right.
You know, all of these things from such a young age are just permeated into our psyche of, to age is a bad thing, to be, you know, overweight is a bad thing.
Yeah.
But then equally it's like, to be too skinny is a bad thing.
Right.
You know, so there's this weird thing where it's like, okay, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be because it doesn't seem to exist.
I know.
And that is what, so I feel like every woman in one way or another feels like they're not good enough because they're striving for something that's unachievable.
Right. It's a very fine line to tread, but also the goalposts are forever shifting because we have all these beauty and body trends that, you know, come and go.
And what are
It's
your
like,
thoughts on some of them? Because obviously, yeah, I'd be curious to know.
I mean, I always think of the one in the, you know, the 90s, and it was like not good to have a big bum. Like, that was really not a good thing. It was not coveted at all. There was even that book, "Does My Bum Look Big in This?" You know, that was like the famous phrase, wasn't it? "Oh, does my bum look big in this?" And fast forward 20 years, and a big bum is the most coveted beauty trend, to the point that, like, BBLs are, it's like, I can't remember the statistics, but I mean, it's enormous now, that market. So it's like, we can never actually win. We can't win unless we devote our entire capacity to it, all of our energy and our time, and crucially our money as well. You know, we pour everything we have into keeping up with these trends, and then maybe we can, you know, maybe some of us can get there and keep up with them. But for what? Like, that's the thing that I always come back to, like, for what?
But if we kind of unpacked it on a deeper level, what do you think the intention behind the narrative is? Because it's obviously created for a reason. It doesn't just happen.
I think it's a tool of the patriarchy to keep women occupied, to keep them busy, to keep them quiet, and to keep them small, both literally
and metaphorically.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it does. It really does. For anyone listening who's been on a diet, you'll know that it occupies, when you're on a diet and you're having to restrict yourself. Restriction's a really difficult thing for our bodies. We don't like it. We have a visceral biological response to it, a backlash.
Function.
And we can't function. You've got no energy for anything else. You've got no capacity for anything else. It keeps us busy, and it keeps us occupied, and it keeps us small.
Which is a pretty dark thing to sort of recognize, but at the same time, a lot of liberation in that. And, you know, part of the work that I feel very passionately about right now is to kind of decondition all of these things and question whether it's actually how you feel or what you think or what you value versus what you've been taught or told to believe about yourself.
Right.
So what has that kind of journey been like to really decondition some of these things for yourself? And what, because there's obviously everywhere you're faced, whether it's a newsagent and you see a magazine or just a conversation you have with someone, it's constantly being reinforced. So it's an active thing and an active choice every day to push against that and to continue to decondition and unpick it.
I'm like naturally not very good at that. I don't think I'm naturally a good critical thinker. I think I'm good at going along with the status quo and not questioning things and not challenging things. So that for me is something that I continue to work on and continue to try and do. I mean, I guess this is true for a lot of us as well. Like I look back at the television shows that we consumed even just like 10 years ago, or like the magazine articles, and it once occurred to me that the stuff that I was reading wasn't right. Like that article about Princess Letizia with the grey streak. 10 years ago, I would have been like, oh God, yeah, she has let herself
She's let
go.
herself go. I actually know what made me think about when I saw it was, I've never forgotten this, but when I was at school, I had a very funny, eccentric history teacher, and he was very amusing, and like, I really liked him. But I remember him telling us that Anne Boleyn got beheaded because she let herself go.
No.
And it was like one of those things that he was sort of joking, and I hope I've got that historically right, but he was essentially, again, it was just that thing I remember thinking, oh God, I best not let myself go. Do you know what I mean? So again, it was like,
the job.
And I don't think that was would necessarily be accepted today, but he sort of meant it with a lot of humor, and it was a fun, silly thing to say. But at the same time, it was, again, perpetuating this thing that if you don't stay on track with all these unachievable things that do consume every waking thought or moment, that you might be beheaded.
Off with your head.
Off with your head.
I see your grey hair. Goodbye.
I know. Because also, how do you feel at this age and stage where, I mean, I don't know, are you in a relationship?
Yes, married.
A lot of it is around what I notice, people feeling this fear for women around being single, these expectations that they have to have ticked all these boxes, and if they don't, they're going to be sort of discarded by society. And that, again, it's like, but why? Because men get a very different thing. They get called, bachelor and
I know,
eternally single and sexy, and women are like spinsters and Bridget Jones.
Right. Tragic.
Yeah, tragic.
Yeah.
And even if you look at the film Bridget Jones, it's like she was a very normal size, still young and very pretty.
Beautiful London flat. Like, a great job.
And that was depicted as tragic.
Do you know, my boyfriend and I of 10 years split up when I was 30. I think 30, yeah. And I remember someone saying to me at the time, it wasn't mean, they didn't mean it in a mean way, but they kind of said, like, do you kind of like worry that you've missed the boat?
Really? What, someone online said that?
No, it was a colleague, actually.
But it's like,
but
how
at that time I was
that?
like, oh shit, yeah, maybe I have missed the boat.
But
which is mad. Which is so mad.
Because also I feel like it makes people make bad decisions.
Exactly. They scramble for something. Yeah.
Just to kind of tick that box and do what everyone else is doing. But this idea that everything narrows or opportunities just disintegrate by the time you reach 30. And then you get there and you're like, actually, everything's quite good. And I actually feel quite good about myself. But society is simultaneously telling me not to.
And I don't know about you, but the older I get, the better I feel in myself.
100%.
Everything feels better and more comfortable, and I feel like my morals and my values feel more in place and solid. And I feel much better now than I ever have done.
Which again feels intentional. It's like a woman really, when she begins to know herself, which I believe happens post 30 and after your Saturn return and everything, and you kind of step into your own authority and your power, but then you're being told to lie about your age, or that if you haven't ticked these things or become a mother, that you're not really a woman, and all of these roles that you're supposed to fulfill and play out that might not really even feel right for you.
Yeah. That's been a big thing for me with, the pressure and the expectation of becoming a mother I found that really difficult.
In what way?
I just feel the pressure. And to be honest with you, of it might be internal as well. I know it definitely is some of it internal as well. But it feels like women are on this trajectory, and it's something you have to do. It's like this box you have to tick, and if
like
you
you're going
don't,
into the sort of farming industry, like pump out kids. Like, oh, okay, I guess it's that time.
And if you don't, it's like, well, what's your purpose?
I know.
And it's really hard. I found that really difficult, and trying to field questions from people about it.
What people saying, when are you going to? And yeah. Is it something that you want?
I don't know. I still don't know.
I don't
and
entirely
I feel
know,
like I should know by now, but I just don't know.
I know. And then I guess because I've been having a lot of conversations with people about it, both on the podcast and privately, of this, discussion around, I look at it as like, the female archetypes as we move from maiden to mother, that doesn't necessarily mean literally becoming a mother. It's kind of into a next stage of womanhood.
Yeah.
But actually questioning whether motherhood in itself is right for you or not is a huge thing.
Right.
It's the one thing you can't undo.
No, you can't.
You can't
give it
send that back. You can't return to sender.
No,
and so
it's yours.
Yeah, and because again, it's like we're told so much that that's what our purpose is as women. That's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to reproduce. That if we don't, it's like, well, am I in some way incomplete? And then the other scary side to that is it's not like we have forever to make the decision.
Exactly.
So I've got a lot of friends that are, late 30s, early 40s, and they've actually said, I wish I did these various things. Perhaps it was egg free, just to give myself a bit more time. So there's that other side of it that can be
and
difficult.
That has been, I've done some embryo freezing.
I remember you saying when we were speaking, what was that process like?
Do you know what? My experience with it was honestly fairly positive. I know that everyone has different experiences, but I reacted fairly well to the hormones. I mean, as in emotionally and physically, but I have a low ovarian reserve, so the results weren't fantastic. But just to have something like, literally in the freezer to like freeze time a little bit has been really like mentally taken off a load.
I can imagine.
Yeah, and there's something, this feels everything fertility and having this biological clock ticking, it feels like there's a lot of like you don't have any power, you're not in control of it. And it's been a really great way to take back a bit of power and feel more empowered with it. So I'm all for it. I know it's a huge financial expense, and I know that not everyone has the means, but if you do, I really do recommend it. Because
just to add for people listening, the embryo freezing is when you actually take your partner's sperm, as opposed to egg freezing, which is just it's fertilized. So the egg's fertilized and becomes an embryo. Yeah. What was the process like in making that decision with you and your partner?
Well, I did a blood test to determine ovarian reserve. So it was an AMH test, it's called, and I did it really not thinking anything. I was just like, I was actually offered it through work, and I was like, oh, cool. Sure. I think I was 32 at the time, and I thought, it'd be interesting to see. But I mean, I've got 4 sisters. 2 of them had babies really easily. My mum had 5 girls very easily. It's just something that never ever occurred to me. So when the results came back and they were really low, I was like, I was scared, but not quite scared enough to make me want to do something about it imminently, as in try for a baby imminently. So it felt like good middle ground. Yeah. I mean, I spent a while like not sure what to do, and that was the worst part. But then when I actually decided this is what I'm going to do, I'm going to take control of it, everything got better from there.
Because we've actually never had someone on talking about that experience, so it's quite interesting to hear that you went through it and that you'd recommend it. And like you say, to add, it is a huge expense, but people that I've spoken to that didn't take that opportunity of like, it just is so worth it, and kind of buying yourself that time.
Yeah.
Bringing it back to the kind of the body conversation, what are some of the things that you feel have shifted for the positive today? And what are some of the things that you feel are still quite damaging?
I was thinking about this the other day, actually, because people ask me a lot, like, do you think things are getting better? Do you think things are changing for the better? And I feel really conflicted by this question, because it seems to me, I don't know if this is right or wrong, but this is just my sentiment on this, is that our generation, like as millennials, we've really lent into this conversation and really tried to educate ourselves, and we believe that, you know, all body sizes are worthy now, and we've got a lot more body acceptance than we used to, for sure. And we've also looked at a lot of our toxic thinking. But then in contrast to that, it feels like there's also like and I think it feels like a Gen Z thing to me, where it feels kind of like that resurgence of 90s
size zero kind of, yeah.
Size zero, like the return of the Miu Miu skirt, the low-rise Miu Miu skirt with the super flat stomach, and
like the hip bones sticking out,
right?
Yeah.
And the Y2K fashion, and TikTok seems to be full of what I eat in a day videos with thin women like body checking. And
what body checking?
Like showing how small their waist is,
really
showing how small their thigh gap is. Subtle. It's not like, oh my god, it's just kind of like turning to the side and like have a lot of body checking on there. So it feels really weird, and like these things are kind of like running parallel to each other. So I know that's a really messy answer.
Like, no, not at all. I mean, it makes sense though, in this way that we lived through that when it was happening, and obviously suffered some scars and some wounding from that whole experience and the damage that narrative caused, and kind of recovering from it. Yeah. And then there were, you know, years where there was a real push to do that, but then that generation didn't experience it, right? So don't know the sort of impact that it can have. Yeah, that makes sense. I haven't thought about it like that, actually, but that makes a lot of sense. That they're not quite understanding the severity of the consequences of it. Yeah, but I'm also in a bubble as well. This is the thing. Like, my community,
I am in such a positive
See, me
bubble.
too. It's like a cushioned world. I know. Sometimes when I go to other things, I'll have, you know, I went on someone else's podcast and I sort of was reading some of the comments, and it was so bizarre, because I suddenly was like, my community and my audience isn't the world. And I know that sounds really obvious, but then you suddenly realize that everyone's kind of in their own echo chambers, even if they're positive ones, that don't really necessarily depict what the sort of social, I don't know, whatever is actually floating around for the masses, or like everyone's just experiencing their own sort of unique
and every time it happens, it still shocks me. When my bubbles burst, I'm like, oh shit, like, what? This isn't how people think as a whole. So I always get surprised by that. And, you know, in my space, in my world, I mean, I'm not going to say like body neutrality reigns, because it doesn't. And I think in reality, we are really far from that. But to an extent, it's much more prevalent than in the real world. And then, you know, I'll have a conversation with friends that I'm not, you know, more like acquaintances. And I realize, like, wow, we are still really focused on how thin we are.
Because to sort of explain to the audience that might not know, because we did an episode on body neutrality with Jada, and that's sort of about it. I mean, you're going to explain it much better than me, so would you be able to?
Yeah, so I feel like body neutrality is just, it would be living in a world where how we look didn't impact the way we live, and didn't impact our lives and our self-esteem and our confidence. And I think that's I think body neutrality is a really solid and much more achievable thing to aspire to than being positive about our bodies and being happy with our bodies. I think I am all for people loving their bodies. Like, that is the ultimate goal, and that's so great. But considering where we all start, considering our starting point, like, that is so difficult
to bridge that gap. To
bridge that gap, it's almost impossible. And I think,
and it makes
having
people
that-
feel worse about themselves as well, because you're like I said earlier, if you have that criticism and that self-loathing, to suddenly get to a place when people are telling you to love yourself, you're like, that doesn't feel
right.
Or like love your body.
Yeah.
It'd be like, you know, it doesn't feel necessarily achievable at that moment in time.
Yeah. And I mean, we've been taught for so long to not love our bodies, to like to actively hate our bodies and do what we can to fix them. It's just very difficult, and you're just setting another standard for yourself that ultimately you're going to feel like you're failing again. So I think that's a big part of the reason that people often struggle with body positivity, because it just feels so far-fetched and so far removed from where they're at. So I think body neutrality is just would be a super great middle ground where we just allow ourselves to live without constantly being preoccupied with how we look.
Because it also puts another focus on the body, because you speak a lot about this, but in terms of, you know, the press narrative and just generally people online, or even friends or perhaps family, like we discussed at the beginning, commenting on someone's weight. What are your kind of thoughts on that? Because it's obviously particularly focused around women, because women have forever been objectified, well, not forever, but under the sort of patriarchy have been very objectified.
Right.
To detangle that is such a mammoth task.
Right.
Where do we even begin? Because I've had it when people, you know, friends or people online, and it's like, I've had it from both angles. I've had the press, you know, when I was younger, call me like chubby or curvy caggy. And like, it's when you're, you know, a woman, it's like, you can't call me that. And then equally, I've had people say, you've lost too much weight, you look too thin. And again, it's like, what am I supposed to do?
I can't win.
I can't win. So what is like, what do you think is the kind of way forward with that? What should we all be doing more of or less of?
Do you know what? And this is something, whenever I talk about it online, it becomes like, it surprises me that it's so controversial to say, let's just not comment on other people's bodies. We know that it does harm, it does damage, whether you're insulting someone or you think you're complimenting them by saying, you know, for example, oh, you've lost so much weight, you look amazing. Like,
you don't know
you don't know what's going on, you don't know what's behind it, but also you don't know the impact that you're having
by saying
to that person in the future, because they're thinking, okay, so what happens if I put weight back on again, which is could well be likely if they're on a diet, you know, a lot, or if they've been weight ill or something,
right? It's not a sustainable thing.
Exactly. So what happens then? So I'm not going to look so good anymore when I put on weight. Okay, noted. And also noted that you're assessing how I look. You know, you're making note of how I look, and when I'm thinner, you suddenly see me, you know. And I think I understand that this is divisive, because we are so used to thinking of it as a compliment, and it's like, we're just trying to be nice. And it's like, I know that that's not the intention behind it, but it's the impact that it's having. And if we can just avoid those conversations, you know, about body shape and size. And like, to me, there is nothing wrong with being like, I love your hair color, or I love your t-shirt, or whatever. I think like that's fine. That doesn't go deeper into someone's potential triggers. But
to say, oh, you look really thin, or you look a bit big, or whatever it might be.
Right. It's just like, why?
Because something that happened recently in the press was Ariana Grande put up a thing just basically saying, please don't comment on my weight, because the weight that I wasn't healthy. What was that whole story? And like, why has that become such a huge press piece at the moment?
Yeah, so I think she had lost a lot of weight noticeably, and there was this outpouring of concern, and Ariana, you're too skinny, what's wrong, you need some help. And it sounds like she'd just gotten to a point where enough was enough, and she very gently and very kindly asked people to respect her boundaries and not comment on her body, because, and as she said, you don't know what's going on behind it, and also you don't know you know, you're comparing two different bodies without knowing what was going on behind the scenes.
Like just because what you think, you know.
Right. I always go back to when I was in the thick of my eating disorder, and I was really thick, like way thinner than I should be for my body build and my body type. And I constantly had comments of, you're my thin spo, you're my fit spo, like you look so good, you look amazing, like you look so pretty like this, like it was constant, this
like,
reinforcement.
I'm dying, like I'm feeling terrible,
so ill. So ill, mentally and physically, so ill. So you just don't know what is behind it. And I liked that Ariana did that video. I liked it in one way. Like in another way, I was like, it's crazy that she even has to ask like people to respect.
But I mean, I think celebrities have it more than anyone. I mean, we all kind of have it now that we're online, but celebrities really are under this magnifying glass of scrutiny. You know,
totally
scrutinizing every aspect of their body, circling it, putting it on the front of magazines, cellulite, like it's awful. It's so shaming.
And I think people think they're like fair game, they're up for grabs because they're in the public eye. Like, you know, that narrative of they asked for this. They knew what they were getting themselves into with the fame. And I think people associate like a certain level of like power or influence with, they don't get their feelings hurt anymore. They're not real people anymore, and they're not going to they're not going to care that what I'm saying about them.
It's so untrue.
It's untrue. And it's also, the problem is as well, is that trickles down. You know, someone's saying that about like, not quite related, but like Bridget Jones, when that film came out and it was like, oh, she's so chubby and, you know, she's desperately trying to lose weight. And I was like significantly heavier than her.
Totally.
So I'm watching that people saying that about her and thinking, well, what does that say about me?
I know.
And this is the problem. That's the trickle down effect as well of commenting on celebrities and openly just passing judgment on their bodies.
So I think it is two-part, like one, women gravitate towards that kind of thing and the magazines because it makes them it's that sort of schadenfreude. It makes you feel a bit better about yourself. You're like, oh, if Jennifer Lopez is like cellulite, then you know, that makes me feel better. And if she's being sort of highlighted for it, but like you say, the other side of it is actually there's more subliminal message is you look worse or you will feel worse because this is someone that's got all of these things and we're still tearing them down. So like don't even you try and do anything. Just stay kind of small in your box and feel you know, this like you're not worthy.
Totally. And that feeling of seeing those celebrities being torn down and that making us feel better, that only comes from the pressure that we feel. If we didn't feel that pressure in ourselves, we wouldn't take pleasure in that. We wouldn't be interested. So it's all this horrible, vicious cycle, really.
Which takes a lot of sort of personal sovereignty in to actually, you know, not participate in commenting, in buying those kind of magazines, in talking about people's weight, whether they're famous or whether they're your friends, and actually just being each other's cheerleaders a little bit more.
Yeah. Oh my God. The world would be a much better place. But I also know that it is difficult, and it is hard when we've grown up feeling this pressure, feeling this intense, all-consuming pressure to look a certain way and conform to a certain standard. It's then hard to not enjoy that in someone else. I don't know, that I think that's quite a difficult thing for us to do, and it takes a lot of mental strength, but ultimately it's the best thing that we can do, not just for other people, but for ourselves as well. We're doing ourselves a huge disservice by continuing to, you know, laugh about how celebrities look and gossip about how celebrities look, and even about our friends, you know, oh gosh, she's put on a lot of weight, hasn't she? Through all of that, we're actually also doing ourselves a huge disservice because we're just reinforcing that messaging in ourselves as well.
So it would help that happens to us.
Yeah, exactly.
What would your advice be? Not that you can condense this kind of topic down in any way, but for anyone that's listening that's really kind of going through this stuff and having that feeling like they're never going to be out of it, what would your advice be, and what were some of the things that really helped you and continue to?
I would say that I think it's really good to have hope with this. And when you feel really lost and stuck and hopeless, to know that there is a way out of this. And, you know, if I honestly always think, like, if I can get out of it, then anyone can, you know. It really is possible. But it's just slow, gradual deconditioning and unpicking of all of these beliefs and everything that we've learned. It doesn't happen overnight. This stuff is really ingrained and we're entrenched in it. And I think a lot of patience, a lot of self-compassion, and knowing that ultimately by doing this work, you are really doing yourself a huge service, and it will be so worth it at the end. And just the utmost patience, the utmost self-compassion, and make the most of resources as well. Like we have so many free resources available to us nowadays, which is absolutely incredible. And if you're interested in doing this work, it's more accessible than ever, and I just promise it'll be worth it.
And also to talk to people about it, because I think when we share these experiences that we get kind of locked in our minds and they fester, it's like actually when you can find, whether it's a community of people you find online or a best friend, to actually just acknowledge what's going on can be tremendously powerful. And to kind of echo what you just said, I always love the saying that healing isn't linear. So even if you make a lot of progress with it, and then you're going to have some bad days, and that's okay. And like you said, it in your experience, it might be quite messy too, but that's okay. And it doesn't mean that you're not moving forward with it.
And something that I've found really powerful, that again does not come naturally to me at all, is to realize that how I'm feeling now doesn't necessarily have to be how I'm feeling tomorrow. Like how we're feeling, our recovery, all of it is very fluid, and it changes from day to day. Like when I'm in a bad place, I think, well, this is me now forever. I'm always going to feel like that. And
then it passes.
And then it passes. And I'm like, oh, I wasn't always going to feel like that. And I think it's so powerful to try and give myself that bit of hope. And it's just quite freeing to be like, just because today's like this doesn't mean tomorrow's going to be like this as well.
That is so powerful as well, because it stops you from going down that cycle when you then start thinking, oh, well, it's all futile. There's no point in trying, because I'm never going to feel better. So I might as well making bad decisions, basically. And then you kind of get to yourself to a place when it's harder to kind of pick yourself back up, but rather shifting to a thing of being like, having the self-compassion, I wasn't perfect, but tomorrow's another day.
Exactly. And it's all messy, and that's okay. Like there's beauty in the mess.
100%.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining me.
I love this. What a nice conversation.
I love this conversation. I think it's going to be really powerful for our listeners. So thank you very much for being so vulnerable and so honest.
Thank you for having me. Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Saturn Returns. If you found it useful, I would love it if you could share it with a friend or write us a review on Apple. And as always, remember, you are not alone. Goodbye.